3 days after we buried my grandmother, my cousin slid a piece of paper across the table and said, "Sign it, and this whole thing stays civil." I looked at him. Then I looked down at the paper. And right there at the bottom of page 1 was my signature. Except I hadn't signed anything. Let me back up. My grandmother, Ruth Calloway, was 79 years old when she passed. And I know everyone says their grandmother was special, but Ruth was different in a way that's hard to explain without sounding like you're exaggerating. She didn't just love me. She invested in me. After my parents' marriage collapsed when I was 9 and I became something of an afterthought in both households, Ruth stepped in without being asked. She's the one who made sure I did my homework. She's the one who showed up to every school event. And when I was 14, she sat me down at her kitchen table with a stack of property contracts and said, "Maya, learn to read these, because one day it will matter." She was right. It mattered sooner than either of us expected. Before we continue with this video, please like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Ruth spent 40 years building something real. 3 commercial properties. A carefully managed investment portfolio. Savings accumulated through discipline and sacrifice. By the time she passed, her estate was valued at just over $8 million. She hadn't inherited it. She'd built it brick by brick, decision by decision, over a lifetime. The will reading was held 4 days after her funeral at the office of her estate attorney, Mr. Ellison. I walked in already hollowed out from grief. I wasn't thinking about money. I was thinking about Sunday phone calls I'd never get again. But something happened in that conference room. Something that made my stomach drop before Mr. Ellison even finished reading. I noticed it and I stayed quiet and I filed it away. I wasn't sure what it meant yet. What I did know was this: my cousin Derek had arrived at that reading looking completely composed. Not grieving. Not anxious. Composed. Like a man who already knew exactly how the next hour was going to go. And then Mr. Ellison read my name. More times than anyone in that room seemed to expect. I watched Derek's face go absolutely still. After everyone else had cleared out, he asked me to stay behind. He had a proposal, he said. He just wanted to talk. That was the moment I should have left. But I stayed. And what he put in front of me changed everything. Derek's proposal wasn't a conversation. It was a presentation. And he'd clearly been rehearsing it. He pulled out a folder, clean, tabbed, organized, and laid it on the table between us like this was a business meeting. He called it a family trust restructuring. He said it was about honoring Ruth's legacy, about keeping the estate unified instead of fragmented. He used words like stewardship and continuity and what Grandma would have wanted. He was smooth. I'll give him that. But here's what you need to understand about Derek Calloway. He is 7 years older than me, and for most of our lives, he operated like the family's crown prince. Ruth's son, my Uncle Marcus, was his father, which meant Derek felt a certain ownership over the Calloway name that nobody had actually granted him. He showed up at every holiday with that easy confidence, that loud laugh, that way of filling a room and making sure everyone noticed. People liked him. He was likable. That was always the danger. What people didn't see, what Ruth saw, and what I eventually saw, was the pattern underneath. Derek had burned through 2 businesses in his 30s. There were loans that didn't get repaid. Favors that were called in and never returned. He was the kind of man who was always one good opportunity away from turning everything around. He just needed the right situation. And now Ruth had handed him what he thought was exactly that. About 6 months before she passed, Derek had moved back to town. Suddenly, he was visiting regularly, bringing flowers, sitting with her on Sunday afternoons. The family said he'd finally grown up. I watched Ruth during those visits, and I noticed something I couldn't quite name at the time. She was warm with him. She was always warm, but there was a carefulness in her eyes, like she was measuring something. I didn't say anything. Maybe I should have. Back in that conference room, I'm sitting across from Derek and his clean folder, and I'm listening to his pitch, and something is pulling at the back of my mind. I work as a paralegal. I spend my days reading legal documents. And the paperwork he's sliding toward me, it looks official, but something is slightly off. The margins, the font spacing, the letterhead doesn't sit quite right. He tells me Mr. Ellison has already reviewed it. He says it with complete confidence. I ask him one question. Quiet, calm, almost casual. Which attorney reviewed this? He says Ellison's name without blinking. I tell him I need 48 hours to look it over. He agrees immediately, too quickly, like a man who thinks he's already won. On the drive home, I call Mr. Ellison's office. The receptionist picks up on the second ring. I ask if Mr. Ellison has been available this week to review any client documents. There's a brief pause. Mr. Ellison has been abroad for 10 days, she says. He won't be back until Friday. I sit in my car in the parking lot and stare at the road. Derek hadn't made a mistake. He'd made a calculated lie. And if he was willing to lie about that, within 72 hours of Ruth's funeral, while I was still barely holding myself together, then this folder in my passenger seat was something much worse than a restructuring proposal. I opened it again, and this time I read every single word. So Derek lied about the attorney. That's not a slip. That's not a misremembering. That's a deliberate, premeditated lie told to a grieving woman 3 days after her grandmother's funeral. And the moment I accepted that, everything else shifted. I didn't call Derek. I didn't confront him. I went quiet, and I went to work. One of the first things Ruth ever taught me was that panic is the enemy of clarity. You don't react when you're emotional. You gather, you verify, you build. So that's what I did. I took the folder home, spread every page across my kitchen table, and started at the beginning. The document was titled Calloway Family Estate Unified Trust Agreement. 12 pages. Professional looking. Structured like something a real attorney had drafted. But I've processed enough legal paperwork to know the difference between a document built to hold up in court and a document built to look like it would. This was the second kind. I called a colleague, a forensic document examiner named Patricia, who I'd worked with on a case the previous year. I photographed every page and sent them over that night. She called me back the next morning. Her voice was careful in the way that people get when they're about to tell you something that can't be untold. The document was fabricated. Not entirely. The structure had been lifted from a legitimate trust template. But page 4, subsection 3C, buried under dense legal language about asset liquidity timelines, contained a clause that would grant Derek unilateral decision-making authority over all liquid estate assets within 90 days of both parties signing. Not joint management. Not shared oversight. Derek, alone in control of the cash. And then Patricia told me the part that stopped my breathing. The signature block for my name was predated by 11 days, which meant Derek had prepared this document while Ruth was still alive, while she was in hospice, while our family was taking shifts sitting beside her bed. He was somewhere drafting a contract designed to strip me of what she was leaving me. I sat with that for a long time. Then I called Mr. Ellison directly. He answered from overseas, and I could hear in his voice that he was already unsettled. He'd gotten a message from his office about my earlier inquiry. I walked him through everything. The document, the clause, the predated signature. He went quiet in a way that told me this was serious. He said he'd look into it and call me back. That callback came 1 hour later. And this time his voice wasn't just unsettled. It was shaken. Someone had accessed his firm's document portal 2 weeks earlier using a login that didn't belong to him. The IP address had been traced to Derek City, and only one file had been opened. Ruth's will. Derek hadn't guessed what the will said. He hadn't assumed. He had read it, weeks before the official reading, and then built an entire scheme around what he found there. Every move he'd made since Ruth's death had been choreographed from that moment forward. This was no longer a family disagreement over an inheritance. This was a crime. And I was the only person standing between Derek and $8 million that Ruth had spent a lifetime building. The question was, what was I going to do about it? Unauthorized access to a sealed legal document. A forged date on a fabricated contract. A deliberate lie about attorney review. 3 separate violations, all pointing at the same person, all committed within weeks of a 79-year-old woman dying in a hospice bed. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning I called Mr. Ellison back and told him I wanted to move formally. He didn't hesitate. He contacted a probate litigation attorney named Claire Huang, someone he trusted, someone with a specific track record in estate fraud cases. Claire was 48, methodical, and had the kind of controlled energy that made you feel like the situation was already being handled before she finished her first sentence. She reviewed everything I sent her within 24 hours and came back with one word: airtight. We documented everything. The fabricated trust agreement. Patricia's forensic analysis of the predated signature block. The portal breach logs from Mr. Ellison's firm. The timeline that placed Derek's access to the sealed will 2 weeks before the reading. Claire filed an emergency motion with the probate court to freeze all estate assets pending a full fraud investigation. The judge granted it the same day. And then we waited. Derek found out through the formal court notice. He called me within the hour, and I want you to understand the shift in his voice. The easy confidence, the smooth performance, all of it was gone. What replaced it was something uglier. He demanded to know if I was behind the freeze. He said I was tearing the family apart over a misunderstanding. He said Ruth would be ashamed of me. That last part was the tell. Because Derek had never known Ruth the way he thought he did. Ruth would have recognized exactly what he'd done. She would have sat down, read every page twice, and then made the call I just made. What Derek didn't know was that Claire had authorized a legal wire before that conversation. He said enough in those 4 minutes to confirm his intent on record. Meanwhile, the human cost of all this was becoming impossible to ignore. Uncle Marcus, Derek's father, was aging and unwell, and he had no idea what his son had been doing in the weeks surrounding Ruth's death. I thought about him often during this period. I thought about what this would do to him when it came out. I thought about the family dinners that would never feel the same, the relationships that were about to be permanently altered. I filed the formal complaint anyway, because Ruth spent 40 years building something real, and she trusted me to protect it. That trust was worth more than anyone's comfort, including mine. 2 days before the hearing, Derek showed up to a family dinner like nothing had happened. He laughed. He told a story about Ruth that made my aunt cry in the good way. And I sat across the table from him and said nothing, because Claire had told me to stay calm and let the evidence do the talking. It was the hardest meal I've ever sat through. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning. Derek arrived with his own attorney. Polished, prepared, confident. He walked into that courtroom like a man who still believed he could talk his way out of anything. But the forensic report was already in the judge's hands. The portal logs were already in the judge's hands. And the recorded call, Derek's own voice, unguarded and furious, was already in the judge's hands. For the first time since that conference room, I watched Derek look at something he couldn't charm his way through. Here's what the judge heard on that Thursday morning. Here's what actually happened, from beginning to end, laid out in full. 6 months before Ruth died, Derek had made contact with a junior paralegal at Mr. Ellison's firm, a young woman named Sasha, who he'd met through a mutual acquaintance at a networking event. He cultivated that connection carefully. Dinners, flattery, eventually cash. In exchange, Sasha gave him informal access to the firm's document portal using a secondary login that wouldn't immediately flag in the system. Derek used that access to open Ruth's, while she was still in hospice. He read it. He saw my name attached to the 3 commercial properties and the bulk of the investment accounts. And then he closed the file and started building his response. The fabricated trust agreement had taken him approximately 2 weeks to construct. He'd used a legitimate template as the base, then modified the language in subsection 3C to quietly redirect authority to himself. He predated my signature block to make it appear I had agreed to the arrangement before Ruth's death, which, if I had signed without reading carefully, would have made any legal challenge significantly harder to mount. His plan required one thing, that I be too grief-stricken, too overwhelmed, or too trusting to read the document closely. He had underestimated me. And he had underestimated Ruth, who had spent 20 years making sure I would never walk into a room and not read the fine print. The judge ruled to uphold Ruth's will in its entirety. Every property, every account, every asset distributed exactly as Ruth had intended. The estate freeze was lifted in my favor, and Derek's name was formally removed from any claim on the estate. And then the referral went to the district attorney's office. Derek was charged with unauthorized access to private legal documents, attempted fraud, and forgery. His attorney worked to negotiate the exposure down, but the recorded phone call was extraordinarily difficult to argue around. Derek's own voice, telling me I was tearing the family apart over a misunderstanding, while the court had documentation proving he knew exactly what he'd done, left very little room for reasonable doubt. He pleaded to a reduced charge, 3 years probation, a significant financial penalty, and a permanent legal record that would follow him into every room he tried to charm his way through for the rest of his life. Sasha lost her position at the firm immediately. She faced civil liability and a formal complaint to the state licensing board. Her legal career was over before it had properly started. A bad decision made for quick money, and she would be paying for it for years. Uncle Marcus found out through the family, not through Derek. He called me the night before sentencing, and we talked for almost an hour. He didn't defend his son. He didn't ask me to go easy. He just said he was sorry for Derek, for what Ruth had been put through, for all of it. It was one of the most painful conversations of my life, and also one of the most honest. Some bridges had been damaged. Not all of them were destroyed. 6 months after the hearing, I'm standing outside one of Ruth's commercial buildings on a Tuesday morning in early spring. It's mine now legally, fully, exactly as she intended. I'm not there to celebrate. I'm there because Ruth used to walk the perimeter of her properties on the 1st of every month.
Just to see them.
Just to remind herself what the work had been for. I do the same thing now. I pull out my phone and I scroll to the last voicemail she left me, saved since October. Never delete it. I don't play it. I don't need to. I just need to know it's there. Her voice, still existing somewhere in the world, still reachable. I lock the phone. I straighten my coat. And I walk the perimeter, same as she always did. Ruth built something real. She protected it her entire life. And when someone tried to take it, someone who should have known better, someone she had welcomed back with warmth she didn't know him, the tools she'd spent years quietly pressing into my hands were exactly what stopped it. She knew. Maybe not the specifics. But she knew. And everything she built is still standing.